In 1628, in the German city of Vertsburg, a 9-year-old child was brought into a courtroom, not to testify, to confess. Within 3 days, he had given 14 adults names. A week later, he was no longer alive. His execution was entered into official records. His name was added to lists that stretched across pages. And then the process continued exactly as before. Between 1560 and 1660, what happened in Europe cost tens of thousands of people their lives, but the goal was never to kill. Something else was being built, step by step, case by case, body by body, a machine that didn't need fuel, a machine that didn't need faith, a machine that only needed repetition. When it stopped, entire towns had emptied, families had been erased, and everyone left standing had learned the same lesson: stay silent, stay invisible, and never, ever draw attention. This is the story of what that machine actually did. Not the folklore version, not the simplified version you learned in school, the documented version. Every like, every subscription helps us recover one more erased voice. The version where the names, dates, and procedures are still recorded in court archives that exist today. And the story of why it worked so well, and why its parts are still working today. Witch hunts are typically placed in the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, the era of ignorance and superstition before the Enlightenment came. This is completely wrong. They happened later, roughly between 1560 and 1660, during what Europe calls its Renaissance and Reformation period. An age of the printing press, universities, international trade, and widespread literacy. Martin Luther posted his theses in 1517. The Malleus Maleficarum was published in 1486. The most intense witch hunts occurred in the 1600s. These events overlapped. The same society that produced Galileo, Shakespeare, and the scientific method was burning people alive in town squares. This wasn't a contradiction, it was a feature. Beneath the cultural progress, Europe was fragmenting. The Protestant Reformation had split Christianity into competing factions. Catholic and Protestant regions were now fighting to survive, to gain legitimacy, to maintain control. The 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648 would eventually cost approximately 8 million lives. That was roughly 20% of the population in the affected regions. Plague outbreaks returned in waves. The Black Death never fully disappeared. Smaller epidemics ravaged towns every few years. Harvests failed repeatedly. The period between 1560 and 1660 included decades of cold temperatures that historians now call the Little Ice Age, which shortened growing seasons and destroyed crops. Governments were fragile. Borders constantly shifted. Local authorities competed with regional powers. Kings clashed with nobles. Everyone was fighting everyone. And in the middle of all this chaos, ordinary people were trying to survive. When things went wrong, and things constantly went wrong, people asked why. Why did crops fail? Why did children die? Why did neighbors turn violent? Why did everything feel like it was falling apart? The answer couldn't be chance. It couldn't be bad weather, disease, or political instability. Those explanations were too impersonal, too uncontrollable, too overwhelming. People needed a reason they could identify and someone they could blame. The devil. Not as a metaphor, not as a symbol, not as a distant theological concept, but as an active, presently existing force working through human agents to destroy Christian society from within. This belief was nearly universal. Protestants and Catholics disagreed on almost everything: worship practices, church authority, salvation, the nature of faith. But they agreed on this: the devil was real. His servants were real, and they lived among ordinary people, in the guise of neighbors working to bring about the end of the world. When crops were destroyed, it wasn't the weather. When children died, it wasn't disease. When communities fractured, it wasn't politics. Someone had caused this, and that person lived nearby. Some people attracted more suspicion than others. The pattern was fairly consistent across different regions: widows without family support, Women living alone after their husbands died had no male protection and no economic security. They were vulnerable and visible. Healers who used herbs and charms. Folk medicine had existed for centuries, but now these practices were being reinterpreted as demonic. Midwives who were present when births went wrong. Infant and maternal mortality rates were extremely high. When tragedy occurred, the person who was there became the explanation. People who argued with their neighbors. A dispute over property, animals, or debt could last for years. When misfortune came, the argument would be remembered. People who didn't attend church regularly. During religious war, irregular attendance suggested something. Simply unpopular people. Sometimes there was no clear reason, just years of accumulated resentment, jealousy, or discomfort. Once someone's name was mentioned, they became the explanation for everything that had gone wrong. The bad harvest 3 years ago, they must have cursed the fields. The animals that died last winter, she made a deal. The stillborn child, she was there when it happened. Fear didn't need evidence, it needed a name. That year, 2 German Inquisition judges, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, published a book. Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches. It wasn't the first text on witchcraft. Books about magic, demons, and evil had existed for centuries. But this was different. It was systematic, organized, procedural. It explained how witchcraft worked, how witches operated, how they were recruited by the devil, how to identify them, how to interrogate them, and most importantly, how to justify what would come next. The book was printed across Europe, translated into multiple languages, distributed to courts, churches, and legal authorities. Between 1486 and 1600, it went through 28 editions. It became a reference handbook and normalized a process. The Malleus made several core arguments. First, witchcraft was real, organized, and widespread. This wasn't folklore, it was an actual conspiracy. Second, witches operated in secret. They hid among ordinary people. They looked normal. This meant anyone could be a witch. Third, witches would always deny their activities. Denial was expected. Therefore, denial was not proof of innocence. It was proof of deception. Fourth, physical evidence could be found on the body. Marks, scars, or areas insensitive to pain indicated a pact with the devil. Fifth, the goal was confession. Everything in the process was designed to produce confession. This logic created a closed system. Accusation triggered investigation. Investigation always found something. The accused always denied. Denial proved guilt. Interrogation produced confession. There was no way out. When the Malleus established the framework, courts across Europe began following similar procedures. The process had distinct steps. Step 1, accusation. Someone makes a claim. A neighbor reports strange events. A relative mentions suspicious behavior. Sometimes a child repeats something they heard. The accusation doesn't require evidence. Suspicion is enough to initiate proceedings. Step 2, arrest. The accused is taken from their home, usually without warning, often at night. They're brought to a cell, separated from family and community. This isolation serves multiple purposes. It prevents escape. It stops others from helping them. It signals to the community that authorities are taking action and begins the process of breaking down the accused's sense of reality. Step 3, examination. The body is searched for marks, moles, scars, birthmarks. Any irregularity becomes a potential indicator of the devil's mark, proof of a pact. Sometimes parts of the body are pricked with needles. If the accused doesn't react, whether from natural insensitivity or because fear has numbed them, this is recorded as evidence. The examination was often done publicly or semi-publicly. The humiliation was intentional. Step 4, interrogation. The accused is questioned. Sometimes physical pain is applied. Techniques varied by region but included thumb screws, the strappado hanging by bound arms, leg vices, and the rack. But pain wasn't always necessary. Exhaustion was often more effective. Sleep deprivation, days without rest, continuous questioning, loss of orientation, loss of time, hallucinations. The accused would be woken every few hours, questioned, then taken back to the cell, then woken again. After a few days, most people couldn't think clearly. But here's the critical part. The interrogators didn't expect the accused to invent a story. They provided it themselves. You flew through the air at night. You attended a meeting in the forest. You met the devil there. He appeared as a man in dark clothes. You signed a pact with him. You renounced God. These weren't questions. They were statements. The accused, exhausted and terrified, eventually repeated these details back, sometimes word for word. This was recorded as confession. A confession didn't end the case. It expanded it. Because after the accused confessed to their own activities, the interrogators always asked the same final question. Who else was there? Who else attended the meeting? Who else made a pact? Each name led to another arrest. Each arrest led to another interrogation. Each interrogation produced more names. The system fed itself. The process worked because it was consistent. The same steps were followed in village courts and city tribunals. In Catholic regions and Protestant regions, in wealthy areas and poor areas, when someone was accused, everyone knew what would happen. And this knowledge changed behavior. People stopped defending their neighbors because defending someone accused of witchcraft made you suspect. People stopped questioning authorities because questioning the process made you suspect. People learned to stay silent because silence was the only safe position. Prince Bishop Philipp Adolf von Ehrenberg of Vertsburg oversaw one of the most intense witch hunts in European history. In just 5 years, at least 900 people were executed in his territories. The accused included people from every segment of society. Children as young as 7, university students, priests, city council members, the university's vice-rector, relatives of the judges conducting the trials. A document dated 1629 lists 29 executions carried out at one time. Among these names were a girl aged 9 or 10, a boy aged 12, Vertsburg's most beautiful girl, a student who spoke many languages, a vagrant child aged 12. Another list from the same period includes Goebbels' child, the town's most beautiful girl, a 10-year-old boy who went to school, 2 strange children. Age provided no protection. Education provided no protection. Social status provided no protection. The process consumed whoever was named. What happened in Vertsburg had another dimension. When someone was convicted of witchcraft, their property was confiscated. The costs of the trial, imprisonment, interrogation, execution were collected from the accused's estate. If they had land, it was taken. If they had savings, they were seized. If they had possessions, they were sold. In some cases, the families of those executed were left with nothing. In other cases, the families themselves were accused next. This created an economic incentive structure. Cases generated revenue. Confessions produced more cases. More cases produced more revenue. The machine became self-sustaining. 60 miles away, Prince Bishop Johann Georg II Fuchs von Dornheim ran his own campaign. He built a special facility, the Druden House, the Witch House. It was specifically designed to process witch trials. Interrogation rooms, cells, administrative rooms where confessions were recorded and property transfers were documented. During this period, approximately 600 people were executed in Bamberg. Among them was Johannes Junius. He was the mayor of Bamberg, a respected official, an educated and reputable man. In 1628, he was accused of witchcraft. During his imprisonment, Junius managed to smuggle a letter to his daughter Veronica. The letter still exists. In it, he described what happened during his interrogation. He was shown the instruments. He was told what would happen if he didn't confess. He insisted. He was innocent. They applied thumbscrews, then leg vices. He still maintained his innocence. They used the strappado, hanging him with his arms bound behind his back. He screamed that he would confess everything. They lowered him and gave him time to remember. Then they asked him questions. Where did you meet the devil? What did he look like? What did he promise you? Who else was there? He gave them the answers they wanted. He described a meeting in the forest. He described the devil as a man dressed in dark colors. He gave the names of other people. All of it was fabricated under torture. He ended the letter to his daughter. They say I confessed. This is true, but how I confessed, God in heaven knows. They put me through so much that I don't know if I'm alive or dead. Now, dear child, here are all my acts in confession for which I must die. It is all falsehood and fabrication. God help me. 3 days after writing the letter, he was burned alive. What happened in Vertsburg and Bamberg happened in dozens of other places. Trier, approximately 368 executions between 1581 and 1593. Ellwangen, approximately 430 executions between 1611 and 1618. The Basque region, approximately 7,000 investigations, though most weren't executed due to skeptical Inquisition judges. Scotland, approximately 4,000 executions between 1560 and 1707. Specific numbers varied, legal procedures varied, intensity varied, but the basic process remained the same. Accusation, isolation, interrogation, confession, execution, new accusations. Executions were public events. They took place in town squares or designated execution grounds. They were witnessed by crowds, sometimes hundreds of people. The condemned were often transported in carts through the streets before reaching the execution site. The method varied by region. Burning at the stake was common in German territories. Hanging was more common in England and Scotland. Some regions used both. Hanging first, then burning the body. Executions could last hours. They were designed to be witnessed. The spectators weren't there to mourn. They were there to watch. They were there to learn. That accusation was more dangerous than guilt. That defending someone made you suspect. That the process was more powerful than innocence. That asking questions was risky. That survival required silence. Executions taught everyone watching how to behave, and this lesson was reinforced each time the process repeated. Witch hunts didn't continue because everyone believed in witchcraft. They continued because the system became self-justifying. Every execution proved witches existed. Every confession proved interrogation methods worked. Every new accusation proved the threat continued. The machine produced its own evidence. Courts could point to confessions as evidence. Authorities could point to executions as results. Communities could point to the next accusation as justification. Questioning the system required admitting that previous executions might have been wrong, and that admission never came. Confession was at the center of the entire process. Without confession, the system was vulnerable to doubt, but with confession, everything was justified. The accused had admitted their guilt in their own words, often in front of witnesses. That the confession was produced through torture, exhaustion, and ready-made narrative didn't matter in the official record. What mattered was that it existed. The process spread through documentation. Court records from one case were referenced in others. Handbooks like the Malleus were copied and distributed. Legal scholars wrote treatises on how to handle witchcraft cases. Authorities who prosecuted cases in one region moved to another and brought their methods with them. The system standardized not through central planning, but through repetition and imitation. One of the most disturbing developments was the use of child testimony. Children were considered particularly vulnerable to demonic influence, but also less likely to lie, at least initially. In some cases, children's accusations triggered mass trials. In Sweden, in 1668, a series of accusations by children led to approximately 300 people being accused in the village of Mora. About 85 were executed. In Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692, accusations by young girls triggered the infamous Salem witch trials. Children were questioned about what they saw. They were asked leading questions. They were praised when they gave the right answers. They learned what adults wanted to hear. And then, they said it. The system began to collapse when it went too far. When mayors, priests, judges, and nobles started appearing on execution lists, other authorities noticed. The process had become indiscriminate. If status and education provided no protection, then no one was safe. Courts began requiring more evidence. Confessions obtained under torture were quietly discredited. Legal procedures changed, standards tightened. The machine slowed. By 1650, the most intense period was over, but the change didn't come from sudden compassion. It came from self-preservation. Estimates vary, but historians generally agree on a range. Between 1560 and 1660, approximately 40,000 to 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe. Some estimates are higher, some lower. Records were inconsistent or lost, but the general scale is clear. Tens of thousands dead. About 75% to 80% were women. Most were over 50. Many lived alone. Nearly all were economically vulnerable. For every person who died, thousands watched. They watched their neighbors get arrested. They watched trials proceed. They watched executions. And they adjusted their behavior accordingly. They learned to avoid conflict. They learned to attend church regularly. They learned to keep their opinions private. They learned not to stand out. The machine killed tens of thousands, but it controlled millions. Beyond the direct deaths, entire communities were damaged. Trust between neighbors evaporated. Social bonds broke. The knowledge that healers and midwives possessed was lost or suppressed. The fear of accusation changed how people interacted. They were careful. They were suspicious. They were silent. This silence lasted long after the trials ended. Today, thousands of documents from witch trials still exist in European archives. Court records, confessions, execution lists, property confiscations, administrative correspondence. These documents show the bureaucratic nature of what happened. The process was recorded. The steps were documented. The results were filed. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't mob violence. It was administration. Witch hunts are typically described as mass hysteria or collective delusion. But hysteria is chaotic and unpredictable. This was organized and consistent. The same procedures were followed in different regions, different legal systems, different religious denominations. The same questions were asked. The same confessions were produced. The same outcomes occurred. The system didn't hunt witches. It produced confessions. It redistributed property. It enforced conformity. It demonstrated power. It conditioned an entire society to fear accusation more than injustice. Europe's witch hunts killed tens of thousands of people over a 100-year period, but the executions were the smallest part of what happened. What the system actually did was create a template for how to control populations through fear of accusation, a template for how to extract confessions that justify predetermined outcomes, a template for how to make process more important than truth. That template didn't disappear when the witch hunts ended. The same structures were used later. The same logic was applied elsewhere. The same procedures were refined and repeated. Different targets, different justifications, different names, same machine. Witch hunts ended in Europe in the late 1600s, but the system they built never stopped working. It just changed what it hunted. The histories that disturb us most are the ones that show us what we're still capable of. If you want to continue exploring the dark corners of history, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Every subscription helps us keep digging up the parts most stories leave out.